Boy, you've given me a very mistaken belief of power here. I know you're all eagerly anticipating hearing from our speaker and reader this evening, and we won't detain you too long from that. We do want to welcome you to Rice University and the Shepherd School of Music's beautiful Studi Concert Hall. We thank you for joining us on this Leap Day evening for what promises to be a memorable time together. I am very grateful to Rich Levy and Inprint for the opportunity they offered to bring us together in welcoming a remarkable poet and author to the Rice campus for tonight's presentation. Tracy K Smith's appearance is especially meaningful as it occurs at the intersection of two important occasions. The first is, of course, that today marks the final day of Black History Month, during which we as a nation remember the history of Black Americans, the good and the bad, and celebrate the contributions of Black Americans to American history, culture, and success. This year marks the 90th anniversary of that celebration, which originally began with a week in February and was expanded 40 years ago to a full month. The other occasion hits even closer to home as we as a university are currently celebrating and remembering the 50th anniversary of the first African-American undergraduate students to attend Rice University. During 1965 and 1966, the first Black undergraduate students were admitted to Rice University, marking one of the most significant milestones in the school's history. In celebration of 50 years of Black undergraduate life, Rice University, working with the Association of Rice University Black Alumni, ARUBA, and partners across the campus, is featuring a year-long series of events designed to reflect upon Rice's history, to celebrate cultural heritage and inclusiveness, and to foster the exchange of ideas across generations. And I especially want to welcome both the current and incoming chairs of ARUBA, Akila Mance and Monique Schenkel. And so we are thrilled to welcome tonight Tracy K Smith to join us and the Houston community for a reading of her latest work, Ordinary Light, a memoir. But I would not want you to be misled by the fact that we are celebrating Black History Month and an important Rice anniversary. Tracy Smith's poetry speaks to all of us, something I'll come back to in a moment. She helps us both understand ourselves better and to understand others better. In a time when we are too often focused on the material aspects of human existence, poets such as Tracy Smith remind us that we must seek to understand the human spirit as a fundamental part both of education and what it means to lead an enriched life. Now, I have two things in common with Tracy, and one is not writing poetry. We were both one of 5 children, and we were both undergraduates at Harvard College. Ms. Smith earned her MFA at Columbia University and thereafter won a prestigious Stegner Fellowship at Stanford. She now serves as professor and director of creative writing at Princeton University. Already among the most important poets of our time, her first collection arrived just over a decade ago. She has won numerous awards, including, of course, the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, which was given for her 2012 collection, Life on Mars, which, as the New York Times' Joel Brewer noted, does what, quote, all the best poetry does. It first sends us out into the magnificent chill of the imagination and then returns us to ourselves, both changed and consoled. While we cannot promise you that you will leave tonight both changed and consoled, I think we can be assured that you'll be inspired by one of the truly great voices of our day. But before we welcome Tracy, let me turn over the podium to Rich Levy, Executive Director of Inprint and our partner in this evening's endeavor.
Well, thank you, President Lebron, for your wonderful hospitality. This is an amazing hall, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm delighted to welcome you to yet another installment of the 2015-2016 Inprint Margarett Root Brown reading series, which, as you know, features Tracy K Smith. For 35 seasons since 1980, this series has presented nearly 350 writers from 28 countries, including winners of 8 Nobel Prizes, 60 Pulitzer Prizes, 55 National Book Awards. It all helps to feed our love of great books and the people who write them. And I'm not going to say much about Tracy, but I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Next month, because it was a beautiful introduction from President Lebron, next month the series continues on March 28th. I hope you'll join us back at the Wortham Center. 2 great fiction writers, Matt Johnson, our own Matt Johnson, and Helen Oyeyemi. And they'll be reading from their new books, respectively, Loving Day, and Helen's book is What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours. I like saying that title. Individual tickets for this reading go on sale online tomorrow at noon, and in April, we feature poets Tony Hoagland and Sharon Olds, National Poetry Month. We hope you'll join us. Details at inprinthouston.org. On Sunday, March 13th, the Inprint Book Club will meet at Inprint House, 4 p.m. to discuss Tracy's Ordinary Light, which she'll be reading from. And please visit the Inprint website. You can sign up for Facebook, Twitter, join our email list, visit our blog, an open book. And I should say, we are live streaming this reading tonight in partnership with our friends at Houston Public Media. So if you have friends who couldn't be here tonight and would enjoy this, text them now and tell them they can tune into the reading through our website, inprinthouston.org. Thank you. We present the Inprint Margarett Root Brown reading series in association with Brazos Bookstore and the University of Houston Creative Writing Program. This series is made possible by the extraordinary support of the Brown Foundation. It's named for founding trustee Margarett Root Brown. We are also grateful to underwriters Weatherford International and the National Endowment for the Arts, Artworks. Special thanks to United Airlines for in-kind travel support, to Houston Public Media, and to our marketing partners, Rice University Multicultural Community Relations, in the Office of Public Affairs, and the Boniuk Institute for the Study and Advancement of Religious Tolerance. Inprint receives support from the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance and the State of Texas from the Texas Commission on the Arts. Last but not least, our endless and continuing thanks to our season ticket holders who helped to make this series possible and accessible to everyone. After the reading, Tracy will have a conversation here on stage with Paul Otremba. Good, there's water there. Poet and faculty member in the Rice University English Department. And then we'll have a book sale and signing in the lobby. Our thanks, of course, to Brazos Bookstore, fine independent bookseller offering discounts on books tonight and all season by authors in this series. Now please set your phones on stun, silent mode, no flash photos, no taping, except for those authorized to do so. Thank you. I'm not going to do any biographical information, but I have 3 interesting details, since really she's been beautifully introduced, about Tracy. There are several references to the you may not know this, there are several references to the recently deceased David Bowie in her 3rd poetry collection, Life on Mars. She notes in an interview that she became obsessed in her 30s with Bowie's extraterrestrial alter ego, Ziggy Stardust. As she says, I love the sense of looking at the sad, paltry, and yet very familiar spectacle that we must make from moment to moment in our lives and in our frenzy as something that's as out there as alien life. In January 2012, Tracy served as NPR's first news poet, spending the day in the newsroom and writing about her experience there. You can find her news poem on the NPR website. And a last interesting fact, when her mother fell ill with cancer, Tracy cooked for her It was the one thing that as a 22-year-old, half stunned by grief, she was capable of doing well, she writes in Ordinary Light. For the reception after her mother's funeral, Tracy baked cakes, including an Alabama lemon cheesecake with lemon curd filling, 7-minute icing, and shredded coconut. A 3-layer affair that is a thing of beauty. You can see a photo of it, and you can get the recipe for it on the New York Times website. Her mother's church friends diced the cake and served it on toothpicks. I should note that she also shares her pound cake recipe on the Times website. Makes me hungry just thinking about it. Let's give a warm Houston welcome to a writer whose careful, thoughtful, rich memoir and poetry makes us think in complicated, rewarding ways about our lives and our country. Tracy K. Smith.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here, and it's been a really beautiful day in Houston. I've gotten to speak with some of you, and looking forward to continuing the conversation. Because of the 50th anniversary of Black students at Rice, I feel like I'd like to read a couple of sections from Ordinary Light that are thinking about my mother and myself in our first months or years as college students. And this is a book that is really, I guess, on one level, trying to recreate a sense of the family that I came from. And when I initially set out to write it, I thought I was doing that for my children, who, because both of my parents are deceased, will not have the opportunity to know them. And then once I got into the process, I realized that it was really something that I needed to do for myself, and that going back to these memories of our family life was really giving me the opportunity to come into what felt like real contact again with my mother, who died when I was 22. And even in, it's really impossible to have a conversation with someone who's gone, but in a way I feel like writing and doing the kind of, I guess, wishful empathizing that might have allowed me to think of what my mother might have been thinking when she was my age or when she was a young mother. Somehow that did feel like a conversation began to happen. This first chapter is called Kathleen, and I guess I should preface it by saying that in the summer, right before I left home for college, my mother was diagnosed with colon cancer, and it was in remission for much of that time, but it was something that really tempered my departure from home. And maybe the other thing that would be helpful to know is that both of my parents, well, my father was in the military and he ended up giving us roots in California, where I grew up. Both of my parents came from rural Alabama, and so I think that comes up in this first chapter, which is called Kathleen. In the first strange and strangely free months of life on campus, I didn't make much mention of my mother's cancer. Either I had convinced myself that it really was gone because the polyps that contained it had been cut out by the doctor, or I was afraid that introducing her to my friends by way of such a story would make that the only story about my family and me. On the occasions that I did speak of the cancer, I was careful to lean toward the past tense, emphasizing the fact that she was fine, that the surgery was a success, and there was now nothing to fear. This was partly because that's what my mother, in her weekly phone call, was eager to have me believe. She used the word eradicated, which seemed to ride on the wind of a massive exhalation, the kind preceding a statement like, "That was a close call." And partly because I was afraid of considering the situation from any other vantage point. But I think it also had to do with wanting to preempt the look on anyone's face, a mix of condolence and abject pity, as if they'd just learned that I grew up a foundling, that arose whenever I said my mother was diagnosed with cancer. Whenever someone managed to look me in the eye and say, "I'm sorry," in the way people did once they learned that malignant tissues had been removed from my mother's body, it frightened me more than the idea of cancer itself, which, by the winter, was moving around freely in my mind like old shrapnel, lying dormant for whole long stretches before jostling up against something that registered an alarm. At those times, my mother became a specimen, someone beholden to the whims of a near stranger's polite curiosity. If the person was familiar with illnesses of that sort, then I'd have to field a set of follow-up questions that made me feel like a kid in a spelling bee. What kind of cancer is it? What stage is she? How is she responding to the chemo? Has she been given a prognosis? And if it was someone who didn't know what to do with such a pronouncement, his expression, a mix of fear or discomfort bordering on distaste, as if I'd just sneezed in his face, seemed to flatten my mother out and pull her away from me like the heroine at a drive-in movie. Naming what was happening had a way of making it irrevocably real and making my mother into someone I was suddenly aware I had only barely known. What could I tell anyone about her? Not just about how she'd taken care of me or what I felt like in her company, but about where she came from and who she'd been long before me. Throughout my growing up, she'd entertained me with stories of farm life. One afternoon, when she taught me how to cook a chicken, she'd reminisce that at my age, she would have been told to go wring the bird's neck and pluck its feathers before dressing it for roasting. When I helped her roll out biscuit dough and cut it into circles using the mouth of a coffee cup, she'd sometimes remind me that she had learned to do the same task when she had been a mere 5 or 6 years old, standing on a chair by the kitchen stove. There were always bits of her childhood popping into our day-to-day life together, but her past remained an assortment of disjointed parts. I'd backed away from so much out of fear of what it might force me to accept, namely that along with these quaint or colorful facts of country life came a darker portrait of struggle and injustice. Dread of such narratives, stories like the one about the great uncle way back when, the one who'd been killed for the money in his pockets, caused me to stifle the very questions that could have afforded a more continuous view of my mother's story and the story of her, of our people. My mind, in its eagerness not to know too much, had managed to focus on all the wrong details. How disgusting it must have been to lift the bird up by the head and swing its body around in the air, or how surprising that a 5-year-old could learn to measure ingredients to the correct proportions. What my squeamishness had cost me was beginning to feel a bit like my birthright. I knew that my mother had also been a gifted child, graduating from high school and leaving home for college at age 16. When I was honest about my own motivation for excelling in high school, leaving home and situating myself in a world of my own choosing, I couldn't help but imagine her feeling the same way as a girl, looking out the kitchen window in Alabama and thinking of what it would be like to cast herself in a different kind of life. Growing up, hadn't she leapt at the chance to spend her summers with her grandmother in the city of Mobile? And didn't the story go that she had long ago changed her name from Kathleen to Catherine, mainly out of annoyance at the way Southern mouths seemed to add an extra lazy syllable every time they addressed her? Maybe she thought of that Kathleen as the kind of girl she wanted to leave behind, someone without enough taste, enough poise, someone forever stuck on those red dirt country roads, not going anywhere quickly enough for Catherine's liking. How changed my mother managed to become, how possessed of a quiet refinement, pointing herself toward a future not even she could have named. And and how selfless and heroic her own mother seemed to me then, as I thought about her in this other light. Mother, my grandmother, with all her wits and young fire still about her. Mother, with her stock, steady, wide-legged stance and her gaggle of younger children at her heels. Mother, who had given my mom a dozen siblings out of the fierce desire to save her from the lonely plight of an only child, letting her daughter come to her own conclusions about the world, conclusions that ultimately led her farther and farther from home. I imagined Mom arriving at college with the big green steamer trunk that sat for so many years in the garage of our family house in California. It probably contained 5 dresses and 3 pearl button cardigans, a single quilt, 2 sets of towels, and photos of her sisters perched on stools and smiling kittenishly into the camera. In addition to a Bible, which Mother had probably inscribed with my mother's name, there must also have been other books, which she'd eventually found space for in the room she rented near Alabama State College for Negroes. The few stories I knew about my mother's time as an undergraduate were like the bits of advice I'd been handed before leaving home. They rattled around from time to time, making themselves heard, but mostly they just sat there gathering dust. There was the one about the young man in the library who had been so enamored of her legs that he'd asked her to marry him each and every time he caught sight of her. And the female professor she'd once accompanied to a conference, whose sense of simple elegance had forever impressed her. She brought just 1 skirt, a jacket, 2 blouses, and a sweater, and she never wore the same outfit twice, Mom recollected, whenever she helped me pack for any kind of trip. Freshman year, I tried to hold on to the image of my mother as a young woman hugging a stack of books to her chest, smiling over her shoulder at that boy from the library. It must have felt good, being noticed, having a whole 4 years ahead of her like a blank script. I tried to imagine what she vowed in those first days or months on her own to become. I thought of it as I stood before my own dorm room mirror, sizing myself up, and as I walked across Mass Ave in traffic, feeling for the first time that I was a part of a real place, a place with history. But it was hard to hold on to the thought of my mother before she was my mother. I'd get a glimpse of it just briefly, and then the knowledge of her as my mother would barge in and refuse to leave. Did Mother, who would only have been in her 30s at the time, struggle with a version of the same thing? When I could see past the tired, angry old woman my grandmother had become, I sometimes pictured her trying to envision her daughter in that new life. Did Mother smile or frown at the idea of Kathleen refashioning herself into Catherine, someone other than a country girl from Leroy? Was this fuzziness, this coming in and out of view, anything like what my mom felt in 1990, trying to envision me? In the fall of 1952, when my mother was entering with her class, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, the civil rights activist and co-founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, would have been finishing his master's degree on that same campus. "Were you a part of the civil rights movement?" I remember asking her when I was in Miss Dyer's 3rd grade class. Her eyes smiled a little when she answered, as if her mind had gone back to the exhilaration of that time. I could recognize the pride and something else, something more private, enveloping her. "I went to Dr. King's trials," she said, "and after Rosa Parks' arrest, I went to her trial. I was a part of the Montgomery bus boycott. We all were. We carpooled and walked for a whole year instead of riding on the segregated buses." And I tried to hold on to the image of her walking along the wide, sun-blasted sidewalks of Montgomery, a place I could only envision in black and white, like an old newsreel. I always saw her with a Sunday hat and a handbag dangling from the crook of her arm, walking with her back straight and her head held high as bus after empty bus rolled past. Even if she was only part of a crowd, a throng of students whose names or actions would never rise to the surface of that written history, how intensely alive must she have felt, and how like a pioneer to be among those making a claim for a different kind of existence. And how unprepared, how timid and afraid. How could it have been any other way for a country girl of 16 in a world where so much was at stake? I arrived in Cambridge eager for small freedoms. I wanted to go out at night. I wanted to be able to wander the streets of the city, to disappear into bookstores and movie theaters. I wanted to be able to drink alcohol and kiss boys. My young mother must have wanted some of those things too, but her drive must also have been for something larger and less private. She must have left home, at least in part, so that she could stand alongside the other members of her generation and take action in the ways her parents had probably warned her against. Arriving, for her, must have felt not only like one of the first inklings of her own personal independence, but also, and perhaps more emphatically, like the first euphoric indicators of a new era in public history. Did she feel as free and, at times, as alone as I sometimes did during that first autumn on my own, striving to carve out my space in a world where it seemed that so little of what I had spent my short life learning and believing actually mattered? And was there a sense of conflict for her, as there was for me, in breaking free from the place and people who had raised her? A sense of guilt in choosing the new life as preferable to the old? Because my mother had done it, had laid down the old life like a too small garment and stepped eagerly into each layer of the new, I told myself I wasn't completely defying her when one by one I let my own wishes and desires replace the values she sought to instill in me. But if I really felt that way, why didn't I ever tell her so? Sometimes it did feel like she must have heard me as I thought, must have been there with me, even if only in minuscule tokens. The lace she'd tatted onto the edges of my towels, or the whiff of Jean Patou's Joy. The bottle belonged to her. She'd said yes when I asked, completely ignorant of its extravagance, if I could pack it among my things, that I sometimes wore to class on the insides of my wrists, never smelling completely like myself when I did. I wasn't quite my mother then either. Maybe I was the idea of her younger self, the one I sometimes tried to reach with my thoughts, the one who would surely have wanted to live in that delicate exhalation of jasmine and new grass, and, deeper under the surface, a living kind of heat, like a young woman's wish, if such a thing could be weighted to the skin. And I'll skip ahead to a chapter that I guess takes place about a year later on Harvard's campus, where I'm kind of coming into a sense of political consciousness that surrounds race. I, too. I don't know what that white boy did to you, my cousin Nina said, but whatever it was, it must have been bad. That wasn't her way of asking me to tell her all the nitty-gritty details of my breakup with Andreas, which was now nearly a year behind me. She was commenting upon the recent change in me, one of many she'd witnessed over the span of our relationship. I was no longer the goody-goody girl she'd encountered on her first visit to California when we were both children, though, as far as she, in all her savvy urbane know-how, was concerned, I probably had more than a little of that child left in me. For her part, she still had a portion of the sass that had hit me like a cold front long ago. But our child selves were buried beneath other things, having been tempered by the growing up we'd managed to do in the dozen or more years since we first met. The change Nina detected was knotted into the dreadlocks I was cultivating and it was stippling my underarms and legs, left unshaven in defiance of I'm still not quite sure what. It was evident in the newly acquired rhetoric, phrases like the white power structure, women of color, and the black community that had begun to pepper my speech. I'd gone militant. If Nina was right, she'd succeeded at pinpointing a connection I hadn't myself been willing to acknowledge. As far as I was concerned, my awakening had started in the fall of sophomore year with a course on African American literature. When we read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, I'd felt, possibly for the first time, like I was capable of looking at racial injustice without blinking and of really listening, letting things unfold before me, jab at my heart, and kick my mind into motion. Reading the novel, I'd understood something I hadn't ever considered. Listening to a protagonist is easier than listening to a person speaking in the flesh, even if the two might be saying the exact same thing. The protagonist invites you into such an intimate proximity, asking only to be heard, and then proceeds to say a thing like, I have been hurt to the point of abysmal pain, hurt to the point of invisibility. If someone had said that to my face, my esophagus would tighten, my temples would flush, and my heartbeat would thump louder in my ears. I'd retreat, too ashamed and too guilty to stand there listening to what the world had insisted again and again upon doing to a person with skin hued like my own. And yet the voice on the page, saying these very things, entered me differently. My eyes raced across the lines, chasing down every sentence. It was more than simply loving to read, more than simply loving a good story. It was about realizing I was capable of opening my eyes and ears in such a way as to accept the truth of what I was reading and admit the pain. Novels, essays, and poems about race in America did hurt, but they buoyed me too. I'd never read so many books by Black writers before: Ellison, Hughes, Hurston, Baldwin, Wright. I'd recognized a version of my own daydreaming, my own longing for the future and for true experience in Janie, the protagonist of Their Eyes Were Watching God. Janie's looking, waiting, breathing short with impatience, waiting for the world to be made, became my own tendency to lurch with all my imagination toward a moment when my life would magically begin. And once that bond was cemented, once I'd claimed a piece of the character's subjectivity as my own, it was almost as though following Janie through the rural Black world of the novel, immersing myself in her experience and in the details of the place she belonged to, was a way of undoing the fear and squeamishness with which I'd once reacted to Mother and her corner of the South. Janie, or rather Zora Neale Hurston, returned a piece of what I had rejected when I was too young to know better. I could feel these novels healing and enlarging me. Ishmael Reed's mumbo-jumbo reminded me of the vibrant cacophony of voices making up my extended family, the playful and pointed way words could take on a life of their own, signifying another new yet instinctively familiar concept for me, in many directions at once. I felt a heady joy that Jean Toomer's cane might sweep from one register to another so quickly, that one writer might be able to claim dominion over so many different lexicons, saying, "You are the most sleepiest man I ever seed," in one breath, and "Night winds in Georgia are vagrant poets," whispering, in another, without seeming concerned with who was listening, trusting that the reader was listening in the exact right way. These texts allowed two different parts of my person to mingle, perhaps for the first time. The part that lived in and understood Blackness as a thing apart, a thing unto itself, and the part that lived in and understood language as a vehicle for deep feeling and complex thought. One night, the phone in my dorm room rang. It was a friend from high school, a tall, gangly blonde boy named Jacob, who had always been shy and clumsy but brilliant, a voracious reader. We'd talked on the phone in high school about Baudelaire and Oscar Wilde. Jacob was a year younger than me, and our friendship hadn't lasted long past my graduation, but it was a thrill to hear his voice. And because we'd always shared what we were reading, I tried to tell him about the books I'd been devouring in my class. But, he encountered, is African American literature as good as our literature? The statement struck me as layered. For one, he'd presumed that he and I belonged to the same hour. Having grown up together, I suppose that one way or another we did. But the them his hour presumed was pointed both at me and away from me. For if I grew up to be a writer, as he knew I one day hoped to, the books I'd write would not belong to the hour he assumed, the hour he recognized and privileged. Oh, but you're different, he said. Race doesn't really count for you. He was doing the thing that whites sometimes do to the blacks they admire, which is to strip them of their blackness as if doing so were a kind of favor. I had talked about this at length in my seminars on race, but I didn't feel hopeful that Jacob would follow me through the nuances of such an argument, so my next tactic was simply to answer his question directly. African American literature is part of the canon. It's American literature. Invisible Man is an American masterpiece. But Jacob's hesitation, the pause before he assented, drowned out everything else we had to say to one another. When I hung up the phone, I was fuming. Who does he think he is? My roommate sat by, listening to my rant. Two of them were white, but they certainly knew what I meant. It was the early 1990s, after all, and everyone at Harvard was caught up in the conversation about identity, at least everyone I knew. Identity was a badge, a discipline, a spectacle. It was something you could claim, something you could deconstruct, something you could interrogate, something you could even wield if need be. Identity surprised us during those years, spinning in countless ways upon axes of race, class, gender, sexuality, and whatever else we were willing to consider. It was exhilarating to be so astute, so dexterous, so chameleonic. It was also helpful at a time of life when so many feelings remained out of reach, burrowed deep beneath the skin, to believe that identity was something that could be mastered. The spring of sophomore year, galvanized by the thinking imparted by my first semester foray into Afro-Am, that's what we called the discipline back then, I'd enrolled in an 8-person seminar, which introduced us in the first weeks to the work of Booker T. Washington, Malcolm X, and W.E.B. Du Bois. I also took an Afro-Am cinema class taught by Spike Lee, who flew in from New York once a week for the lecture. During discussions, Lee poked fun at a white girl in the class named Stokely, and a black boy whose speech had been tricked out with urban slang in what may have been an effort to compensate for the fact that he'd graduated from Exeter. My studies convinced me I was beginning to live in a new language. I discovered cultural critics who taught me to interrogate notions of otherness, who argued that loving blackness was a means of political resistance, and who gave me the terms within which to consider a thing called black consciousness. Conversation in the seminar room, which sat across the street from the yard and let in some of the commotion of Mass Ave, was lively. There were many of us who were exploring the discipline not merely for intellectual edification, but as a means of recovering something we believed had been withheld by the mainly white schools many of us had attended, and the culture which, when we were children at least, had the habit of making us feel guilty or ashamed for the victimization of blacks by slavery and racism. But it wasn't just about self-esteem. We discussed that in the first class, when we'd covered the text that had once designated Black Studies curricula for just that purpose, to repair black self-esteem. But that was decades ago. The language of such a time and many of the theories and practices it had given birth to was already dated, played out. Now it was much more fruitful to interrogate the subtleties informing the conversation about race and to read, my new favorite verb, at least when applied to things that weren't literal texts, the relevance of a whole number of offshoots from the topic. That semester, I wrote a paper exploring why so many Black revolutionaries had become conservatives during the Reagan era. Privately, I wondered if the assignment might help me learn more about my father, who had never been a revolutionary, but whose service in the military had made him even more fiercely patriotic, and who had voted for Reagan both times. Afro-Am meant many things to me and galvanized me with new energy for my studies. But there were moments when I also doubted that it was enough to become an expert on Blackness. Maybe it was enough for the white students in the class who had no literal skin in the game as I saw it. But for a person like me, how could Afro-Am ever fully be a bloodless pursuit? Wasn't there always going to be an unconscious ulterior motive behind the things I sought to clarify for myself and for others? Sometimes my classmates and I talked about the work of Black writers as if it always involved some kind of tricksterism or sleight of hand. Phyllis Wheatley is speaking in code. Nobody will listen to her if she doesn't praise the Western God. Nobody would even believe she'd written those poems herself if she didn't have the white man's stamp of approval at the front of the book. But what if such a thesis were equal parts true and untrue? What if the language Wheatley had adopted had also gotten inside of her? What if she believed herself when she said, "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too"? Would that make her less worthy of our attention? It would be a wise idea to concentrate in something in addition to Afro-Am, my friend Chris told me. He was a senior who had also been in that first Afro-Am lit class. His presentation on Ellison had impressed me. Ellison wrote for the little man behind the stove, he'd said. He was proposing a reading of Invisible Man that had been inflected by Ellison's essay, The Little Man at Chehaw Station, in which the author recalled being cautioned never to forget about the unnoticed, unassuming little man sitting quietly in the corner, the one who knows more about what is at stake aesthetically and culturally than everyone else. Chris's comments illuminated for me the sense of Ellison's epic by tempering it with a sense of his humility. That afternoon, I'd felt my eyes trying to morph my friend into my image of my brother Conrad. It was a way of acknowledging my respect for him and my wish to do what he was standing there doing, which looked to me like mastering the material, casting it in a new light, adding new layers to the conversation our professor had prompted. I wanted to be able to do that. If you're interested in the field, Chris had coached me, you should think about doing a joint concentration in English and Afro-Am. Having a foot in both realms seemed appropriate, for while there was a version of me who knew and revered the literature my old friend Jacob had called ours, there was also a version of me who believed she was a nationalist. As a nationalist, I attended Black Student Association meetings and participated in the verbal sparring that often erupted around the topic of Black women who weren't dating Black men. I wasn't dating a Black man. I wasn't dating anyone. Maybe the hurt my heart still felt from having been broken up with by a white boy, yes, would it have hurt less if he had been Black, required me to claim a kind of strength and authority. Granted, it was an authority that was merely theoretical, one that lived primarily in the words I strung together in my essays on topics having to do with the countless combinations of gender, race, class, and subjectivity. But as I saw it, a theoretical authority was better than no authority at all. And it gave me a language for thinking about the world, a language that deepened and complicated the ways I saw myself. Some weekends, needing a brief respite from coursework, dorms, dining hall, campus gossip, and roommates, I'd take the bus to New York City. After so many years of living thousands of miles away from my aunts, uncles, and cousins, and of imagining that there were many impassable worlds between us, I was finally getting to know that branch of the family for myself. Those visits had also finally wrested the city itself from my father's narrow view of it, erasing for me his contempt for the sprawling, messy, raucous frenzy of the place. There, on my own terms, letting my eyes climb past the trees to scale the high-rise buildings that never fully seemed to surrender to the sky, I'd felt filled with agency, as if the magnitude of what was human, the skyscrapers, clock towers, mammoth bridges, and the wide avenues electric with traffic, had enlarged me. I could see very clearly why a person would choose to live in a place like that, why a person might race to fall into step with the river of pedestrians, everyone moving with an aggrandized sense of his or her own going, walking, sprinting, climbing, closing in on something, always just a little way off. There was a privacy to the place that intoxicated me, a quiet at the center of that racket into which a person could disappear if she wanted to. Sometimes the quiet of my thoughts and my ideals, which I took to be thoughts I hadn't yet had the opportunity to act upon, like the one about being a nationalist, was intruded upon by one of my relatives, like Nina asking what on earth had happened to me, or my Aunt Ursula wanting to know what kind of job I hoped to get with a head full of dreadlocks. I'm not interested in the kind of job that would discriminate against me for wearing my hair in its natural state. I can now see how the steely rigidity with which I rattled off my new beliefs might have been disconcerting. My mother was unsettled by my new appearance. She thought I looked unkempt, though she grilled me less about what else my appearance signified. But my aunts were not my mother, and they gave themselves permission not just to worry, but also to badger. There's a little boy at my school, Aunt Ursula had told me, whose mother put his hair in dreadlocks. I see him on the playground yanking it out, one lock at a time. He feels stuck. It's not fair. You can be black without going overboard about it, another voice had chimed in. Why stir up trouble trying to make such a big statement? They were telling me that blackness wasn't a costume, and it wasn't a battle, but something most people lived inside of quite naturally, not wrestling with it or feeling obliged to wave it around. Like it or not, they also meant to remind me blackness was also a factor that made some aspects of life harder. Of course, I knew what they meant. Of course, I knew they were right. But up until that point in my life, I'd mostly kept my understanding of blackness inside. Couldn't my aunt see how elated I felt, finally having the permission and the tools to voice my own thinking about race and to unpack such thinking for others, whether or not they wanted to hear it? As far as my New York family was concerned, I was late to the party. They'd lived a great portion of their lives in the South, after all. Even my cousins, who were raised in New York, had had the benefit of regular visits to Alabama, where they, unlike me, had felt at home. They'd been given the language I hadn't or hadn't been willing to receive, and it freed them from having to talk their way through what being black meant. Had they been told to always be twice as good? Maybe. But they'd also been told it was a flaw of the white world to require such a display. I made a trip to New York one weekend in order to visit the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. I'd read about it and was eager to be in the space, to soak up the feeling of all that black art, all that black thinking. My Aunt Carla had driven me there, and on the way home, she'd given me a tour of the Harlem neighborhoods. Weaving along the blocks of Strivers Row and farther north, pointing out the abandoned buildings that had once been magnificent too, but that now stood gutted like dollhouses on burnt-out blocks. After dark, as we were heading back down Lenox Avenue, I'd pointed to the silhouettes warming themselves around garbage cans whose contents had been set aflame. "Wow," was all I could say, spinning around in my seat to take in the sight for as long as I could. There was something about it that delighted me, something real, something that reminded me perhaps of the invisibility Ellison's protagonist described. When I graduate, I want to come here. I want to live in Harlem with all these beautiful black people, I announced. It felt like a homecoming, the little sliver of blackness I'd known growing up in California, a sliver that sat inside the walls of our family house or inside the silence of my mind, leapt now in joy to know that there was an immense realm whose facets gave back occasional glimpses of itself. "Those men are homeless," Aunt Carla said. I could hear the echo of my father in her voice. But there's something so beautiful about them. It was the only word I could access quickly enough to answer her. I didn't want to be just my old self, the one for whom race was a private meditation and nothing more. And while I surely didn't want to be one of the homeless, warming myself by the heat of a trash can set afire, I didn't want to be a stranger to that reality forever. Your parents did everything they could to make sure you wouldn't have to suffer. Why would you want to go backward? Aunt Carla was saying. It was a question that on one level made sense to me, but on another it didn't, and I wasn't able to answer it, not yet. On the Greyhound back to Boston, signs everywhere told me how much farther there was to go. Bridgeport, New Haven, Providence. I treasured that feeling of drifting between places. It helped erase some of the anxiety about where, in the real scheme of things, I was supposed to be heading. And it helped take my mind off the loneliness I sometimes felt now that I was no longer in love, no longer anyone's urgent destination. Moving over ramps and bridges and back and forth across lanes, I relaxed my grip around the confusion, the sorrow, the independence, the wanting, the shifting allegiances, the insatiable wondering that fueled so much of my life. High above the ground, watching the bus's shadows skimming north on Interstate 95, I felt vacant, expansive, subjective, far away, like a cloud pushed along by the wind. Thank you.
So much. Thank you so much for that wonderful reading.
Thank you.
And I'm glad that you read those two sections. One of the things that I really love about your poetry that it carries over into the memoir is the expansiveness, the capaciousness, your ability to take the personal and the public and have them exist right next to each other, and how in your poems and in the memoir they're inextricable. And when you were talking about the origins of the memoir, that you first thought that you were going to write for your children, and then you're writing sort of to speak to your parents, that connection between the personal and the public histories that are demonstrated in the two pieces that you read tonight, was that something that came early in the process of writing the memoir? Was it something that came later? Was that a goal of yours?
It was something that I knew was a goal. Somehow I knew it was a goal from the outset. And I think part of that knowledge or that sense was a little hazy. I knew that there were things that I hadn't expressed in my poems that I wanted to say. I didn't really name them for myself. And so I started writing, and those things were not really coming into the work. And then I started to realize there are these big silences. I'm not talking about a lot of the anxiety I felt thinking about, not wanting to ask my parents about what life in the 50s in the South had been like, and all of these things that first emerged as big gaps in the first draft and the second draft, and that gradually I felt emboldened to begin speaking to. It's funny, like I said, I first wanted to write that book for my daughter, and then I realized it was a way of talking to my parents. But really what I think all writers are doing is talking to themselves, And it was a conversation that some part of my brain knew I needed to have. And it just took a little while before I felt safe doing that, And then once I started, it was exciting to realize, there are things that happened in my house that do shed light on these things that happened in the world outside in the news. And that also, my child perspective on them began to set something into motion that is present in, my adult vocabulary. And it was really exciting to kind of bridge that gap in language.
In the poems, I mean, there are some images that you use in the memoir that are in the poems, and I'm very familiar with Life on Mars. I read it frequently, and so it was nice when in the memoir the part about your father's enjoyment of breakfast, and then your enjoyment of breakfast. I'm like, oh, I know that from the beautiful elegy for your father, and then also in that section. The statement that comes from your father and your mother in the poem, but we learn in the memoir that's from your mother, the request to not have their graves visited. And so to see those images in the memoir, knowing them from the poems, and then when I went back to read your first two books, and the two beautiful sequences for your mother that are in Body's Question and then Duende, more of the images from the memoir appear. So in Joy, which we hear the perfume Joy too, so it resonates. That's the elegy in Body's Question. There's the detail about your mother playing hospital with her sisters and eating the raisins, and then there's the cleaning out a stain with salt and water, and interrogative from Duende. There's that image of driving to the Silicon Valley with your mother. So some of those images, and they resonate profoundly in the poems. And then to see them in the memoir for you as the poet, those images that had power for you, that resonate and drove those poems. What was it like to return to them as a prose writer?
Thanks for noticing all those connections. Those were the things that I remembered most actively, and so they helped me get to the first draft. But I'll tell you, I wanted to write prose, but I was writing poem. I was doing in paragraphs what I do in poems, which was trying to use these images that might create a kind of visceral or emotional feeling, and then backing away from it, letting that have the last word, and it wasn't working. Okay. And it was also redundant from the poems, and it was in defiance of my own wish, which was to dig in a little bit deeper to some of these family stories and experiences. So I knew I had to go back to these things and tell what happened, and then think about it and speak back to it. So it was fun. It was nice when I got to moments where I could hear the poems in agreement with some of the images. It felt like a second chance to do something different and differently generous with some of that same material.
Did they, when they came up, did they give you access to other memories, to other details? When thinking about them, you said that they were the ones that came most readily. And I guess I'm interested in the process of memory and detail in this memoir, which is so exquisitely detailed. What was that process like for you, recovering those details?
Yeah, I found that memory rewarded my persistence. If I sat with something and kept writing around it, little bits would emerge. Like it's a room that is administered by some bureaucratic agency, and you have to keep making requests, and then they give you here's a button, okay, here's what you ate at Christmas. But it was kind of exciting to realize that if I just kind of lived longer and longer with these things, more things would emerge. And then when I got stuck, there were things that could help me, like music. There's a lot of music in the book, I think, because I was listening to the music that was played in my house, or that I was listening to, that helped me remember, this is something else that suggests, like sensation, and that opened up a little bit more detail. And, the perfume was something, it was like another effort to unlock these other recollections. And I thought that buying the perfumes that my mother wore would give me something else, and it did, gave me a paragraph. But I was willing to use any and all of those things. And then I also realize that there are other things that memory does, you know. It's like that, okay, so if I go back to the idea that it's this bureaucratic agency, they also have lifelong jobs. So they mess up sometimes. They're like, it's okay, no one's gonna fire us. So, so there are things that you get wrong, but I think that what I like to think of as the aberrations in the lens are also significant, and they tell us things about ourselves or our motivations. I was reading this afternoon with some students, and I realized that there's a description of my mother and her sister that occurs at one moment in our story, and a realization that happens in looking at their faces. But really, what I drew on to write that little passage was something that happened much later, you know, after my mother was gone, looking at my aunt and seeing my mother and realizing the mirroring that I always had seen that started with my mom was now kind of reversed, and somehow that made its way into another time period. But I think, or I want to believe, that it gave something that was emotionally true back, and so that's how it ended up staying in that chapter.
It feels very emotionally true. You know, in the memoir, your siblings come out in a way that in the poems, you know, they don't, and they're there, but not in the same life. And one of the things that really struck me about the memoir was the openness. I mean, I know that there are secrets in the memoir that sort of drive the tension in the memoir, and you alluded to it here tonight, where you know, you pursuing your own desires and how that might be in conflict with, you know, your mother and what she wishes for you, and and not being able to communicate that with her. So there are these, you know, moments of secrets in the memoir, but there are also these great passages of openness with you and the family, and, you know, at the end of the day, sharing those moments of bafflement or humor or hurt, and scenes with the siblings sharing instruction. And even here, when you imagine the friend as Conrad, you know, it sort of has that feel. That openness with your siblings, with the family, did that help in approaching, you know, because the memoir is a form that reveals secrets.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it did. I felt safe because we are a really close family, and I feel like we know each other now as adults, and I think we trust each other. I felt certain that my siblings knew my intentions were good in wanting to tell this story, or my version of this story. And I also knew I could rely on them for some help, you know. One thing I didn't really want to leave up to my own, you know, the bureaucracy of memory was the facts around my mother's illness, diagnosis, and treatment. I wanted to kind of get that right. And so they were able to help me and tell me this happened and this happened, and no, she didn't do that, she did that. And I learned in talking to them that Conrad, my brother, hadn't even been told the same story at the same time. So there were, you know, that also taught us something, I guess, about what our parents saw themselves as doing, or, you know, protecting us from, or giving us access to. Yeah, I thought a little bit about whether or not I should change their names, and so ultimately I just let them read it, and I said, "What do you think?" And they recognized themselves, and they were okay with it, which wasn't the case, sadly, with everybody in my family. My extended family doesn't really like the version of the story that I remember.
How do they feel about the poems?
It's a nice question. I think poetry reaches readers differently, especially if people who are not like habitual readers of poems. You're reading in a different way. A poem it demonstrates or advertises its artifice so much that it repels this easy attempt to find the biography or to say, this is me. And prose, you know, we believe we live in it, even though I think there's a lot of artifice in writing. It's more transparent. The I in that book is definitely me. And so there's a different kind of implication.
I mean, I felt like as a reader of your work, I felt that, you know, that sort of perhaps a problem. Like, am I reading too much into the poems now, autobiography, right? You know, this is you talking about your life. Of course, with the elegies, you know, there's a closeness there. But you know, so when I was saying I found the images in the memoir in the poem, I mean, was that a mistake for me to be doing that in the first place? I don't know. So I use the poems a lot to sort of frame my thinking about the memoir. And when I was rereading Joy, there was a passage in the final section of that poem where you are talking about memory explicitly, and what you write is, it is true that death resists the present tense, but memory does death one better, ignores the future. And you know, in the context of an elegy, the tension between past and future and present and in the future makes a lot of sense. You know, in the space of the words, the past is eternal, and the elegy. But in the memoir, there's other tensions between the past and the future. And you know, we're an audience that's reading this memoir in the present, right? And you said that you envisioned it being written initially for your children, and you do end, you know, the epilogue talking about your daughter. So there's a sense that this is not only a memoir that is speaking to the present moment, but something that will be extended into the future. Was that something on your mind as you were writing this, or you know, how it speaks to the present, how it will speak to the future, how it will speak to your daughter in the future? Right?
Oh God, there's a lot of weight on those considerations, and I just couldn't deal with thinking about that as I was writing. I think it would have just shut it down for me. It was even, you know, I kept saying, and I still say it, I say, if my daughter chooses to read this one day, maybe it'll be worthwhile for her, because I don't want to make that a real question. Like, will this be something that matters to her in the imminent future when it might be applicable? I had to insert all of these different kinds of distance. And I think it's just what happens when you're trying to find a safe space to really be honest when you're in the process of writing. The way that I will say that I probably was thinking outside of the private was in trying to think about some of the shared history, the public history that somehow connected to the things that were happening in my life and in my family. And I guess also the way that I let the adult self that I am, that lives in now, reflect upon the things that I did and didn't recognize, 40, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But those are questions I'd rather not have to think about. I hope it's a book that somebody else might be interested in asking those questions about, but I think I would just become sad or worried if I dwell too long on the life of the book.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, it definitely speaks to the present. Another way that the book speaks to me is in the reflections on faith, on belief, and towards the end of the memoir, that section where you're at college, the first semester there, talk about the Bible study group that you joined, and in it, you're looking for a way to bring in the kinds of questions that perhaps were not permitted before in your experience. And, you say, we never lingered long enough upon what such extremes of despair or grace or believing would have felt like from the inside. And when I got to that quote, I mean, for me, that is a sort of thesis for what I think your poems are doing in Life on Mars. When I read My God, It's Full of Stars, I was telling you earlier, I had this experience that, that Emily Dickinson quote, I know I'm in the presence of poetry when I feel the top of my head taken off. I had that with that poem, and it was because of this sort of complexity that poem has about living in the despair, the grace, the believing. so for me, I see it in the poems, and I do see it in the memoir, but I wondered if you could talk about how the memoir doesn't only just, talk about faith and belief, but in some ways enacts that too, the way that your poetry enacts that, or maybe that's not something that you would agree to.
Well, I think, in some ways, I think that let's see if I can fit this in a coherent answer. I think that one of the things that this pursuit that I had that had to do with wanting to come to terms with the faith that I grew up in, and also find a way to make it feel useful, even as I moved into a life that was different from the life that had been mapped out for me. One of the ways I can imagine that is, this is the story of someone who's becoming a reader and who's finding life in literature and wanting to be able to invest the same kind of empathy in these biblical characters that one automatically does in a novel, right? Because you're given access to all this interior subjectivity that doesn't always happen in the way that faith is discussed in the church, or at least my experience of church, and I wanted that. I hadn't quite figured out that it was because I wanted the book of the Bible to behave differently, more like literature than it already does. But then I think about the way that writing guides you to discover, right? You don't know the answers to any of these things when you sit down to write. And so if you're lucky, the process gives you something to work with, and it gives you even just temporary answers that you can live with for a little while and then move on from. And I think that it's about listening to some of the ways that language offers itself up as a tool. And some of the things I discovered that felt true for me about faith were things that felt very familiar to me from the act of making poems. Poets talk about the way you're listening for something. It's you, but it's something else as well. And the way that you are trying to find a place in the distance where private experience can connect to something that's a little bit larger, and a way that language can become a living thing, which is like the fundament of the Christian Bible, like the Word was God. So there's a way that the path that language helped me take made things seem like they made more sense, and I felt satisfied with that. Now I'm sure there will be another crisis of faith. But there was something about the process of reflecting and writing and listening that helped me do something that I hadn't been able to do for 40 years of believing.
Yeah. Okay, great. Maybe this is the time now since we're talking about the poems. Would you mind reading something from?
I'd love to.
And maybe we can close with a reading from.
Okay.
Poem. Yeah. Do you?
Is there something specific I should read?
Oh, I have my favorites. My God, It's Full of Stars is my favorite, but that's the long one. There are the It and Company, Us and Company. There are sections if you wanted to read something from The Speed of Belief.
Yeah, maybe I'll read a section from those elegies, just because it sort of brings family back into it. So I wrote this book when I was expecting my first child, who is now 6. And I think that might be one reason why there's so much science fiction in the book, because pregnancy and the fact of becoming a parent is otherworldly. And I was also grieving the loss of my father. And so those two realms overlapped. So I'll just close with a section from the elegy called The Speed of Belief. And now that I told you I was pregnant when I wrote this, you might hear that more loudly in the poem. You stepped out of the body, unzipped it like a coat, and will it drag you back as flesh, voice, scent? What heat burns without touch, and what does it become? What are they that move through these rooms without even the encumbrance of shadows? If you are one of them, I praise the God of all gods, who is nothing and nowhere, a law, immutable proof. And if you are bound by habit or will to be one of us again, I pray you are what waits to break back into the world through me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Those were such insightful questions. Thanks.
Thank you.